Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for logging back into your computers tonight for this wonderful event. My name is Catherine Bolzendahl. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy, and on behalf of my school, the College of Liberal Arts, and Oregon State University, I welcome you to the 2021 Governor Tom McCall Memorial Lecture in Public Affairs. This began in 1982, and the lecture has always had two goals. One is to honor the memory of one of Oregon's greatest governors by keeping alive the ideals and values in public service, journalism, and environmental protection to which he dedicated his life. The second is to bring to campus or to our virtual space notable people in public affairs and journalism who exemplify in their lives the excellence displayed by McCall throughout his career. For me, as someone who studies gender and politics, I'm particularly excited by tonight's distinguished guest, Oregon's Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan, one of 3 women to hold the top political offices in our state. Tonight, introducing Secretary Fagan is the Oregon State University Provost, Ed Fazer. After Secretary Fagan concludes her remarks, we will have time to pose questions from the audience to her. I'll ask that you please enter your questions in the Q&A section that you'll see at the bottom of this window. Provost Fazer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Oregon Secretary of State Shemia Fagan, who will be discussing voting rights, ballot access, and election integrity. Secretary Fagan is a native Oregonian who was born in Portland, grew up in Wasco County, and graduated from the Dalles High School. She earned her BA in Philosophy and Religion at Northwest Nazarene University in Nampa, Idaho. Following college, she earned her JD at Lewis and Clark Law School. Secretary Fagan first entered public service in 2011 when she was elected to the David Douglas School Board in Portland. The following year, she was elected to the Oregon House from District 51, and then in 2018 to the Oregon Senate, where she served as chair of the Senate Housing and Development Committee. And last November, she was elected as Oregon's 29th Secretary of State. The Oregon Secretary of State has many responsibilities. She's auditor of public accounts for state agencies. Her office registers new businesses and maintains the public records of all companies and nonprofits authorized to do business in Oregon. It also houses all public records of state government. Oregon does not have a lieutenant governor, so if the office of the governor becomes vacant, it passes to the Secretary of State. And of course, pursuant to this evening's lecture, the Oregon Secretary of State applies state election laws and supervises all elections, local and statewide. The issue of voting rights and election integrity has been and continues to be of great salience in these times. Following the 2020 elections, amidst charges of election fraud and violence at the US Capitol on January 6th, there have been 361 bills introduced in 47 states that would restrict access to voting. These bills limit absentee and early voting, impose barriers to voter registration and mail-in voting, limit drop boxes, purge voter lists, and require voter ID. Legislation is passed in Georgia and Arizona already, and bills are moving forward in several other states. Oregon, on the other hand, is known for its efforts to expand voter access to the ballot box. When national voting rights leader Stacey Abrams was asked in an interview last November, what would a system that wanted people to vote look like? She answered, Oregon. It is in this context that Secretary of State Fagan has come into her position as caretaker of our elections in the state of Oregon. It's our great pleasure and honor to welcome her here to Oregon State University this evening to hear her thoughts on these issues. And with that, let's hear from Oregon Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan.
Well, what a warm welcome. Thank you so much. And it is an honor to be here with you, albeit virtually, but an honor nonetheless. Thank you so much for having me. And it is particularly thrilling for me to be able to give the Tom McCall Memorial Lecture because former Secretary of State, former Governor McCall, was his book, Fire at Eden's Gates, one of my all-time favorites, was my gateway drug to reading about Oregon history. I read that book well over 15 years ago, long before I ran for any public office in Oregon, and was just inspired by him. And for those of you who have not had a chance to see his portrait in the state capitol, of course, every former governor has a portrait. His is my absolute favorite. Everyone else's is kind of serious and life-sized, and maybe his is life-sized if he was about 30 feet tall. But Tom McCall's photo is a very large person, of course, walking on Oregon's public beaches with helicopters over his head. And it's just a really extraordinary visual of the giant that he has been throughout our history. And he's one of the familiar faces when in the back hallway of my office, there's a line of photos of my 27 predecessors since statehood. And those familiar faces include Norma Paulus, of course, the first woman to hold statewide office in Oregon, Barbara Roberts, who served as Secretary of State before becoming Oregon's first woman governor, Mark Hatfield, who's legendary, of course, our current governor, Kate Brown, was Secretary of State, and of course, Governor Tom McCall, who served as Oregon's 18th Secretary of State. So these images for me are a regular reminder of the importance of this position. When I think of the giants who have come before me and held this position, it is truly big shoes to fill, and it is an honor to be invited to participate in this tradition and to honor the legacy of Governor McCall, who was a figure that really transcended politics, and he instituted transformational change for our state. And that's a legacy that reverberates today in everything from our commitment to the environment, the livability in our public beaches, his work with the bottle bill, and so many other legacies of Tom McCall that we cherish. And my favorite story of Tom McCall, of course, comes from the beginning of Fire at Eden's Gate. He was, of course, controversial for having the "Welcome to Oregon, we hope you enjoy your visit" sign. And as the recession of the 80s took hold, the next governor, Governor Atiyeh, was convinced that Governor McCall's kind of, unwelcome to visitors to move to Oregon was somehow to blame. And Governor Atiyeh planned to blow up this sign that stood at the border of Oregon and California. And Governor McCall was invited to come, which of course nobody expected him to come, and he showed up and they gave him the microphone. He did not apologize as he was expected to do, but really just talked about how Oregon is not just going to throw herself at everybody, that she's going to play hard to get, and that she's going to have high standards. And it's one of my favorite stories. And in his inaugural address to the Oregon legislature after he was elected governor in 1971, Governor McCall famously said, "We who are privileged to be in these chambers today," and I picture those chambers, the House and the Senate, where I have served and am honored to have served. He said, "We are privileged to be in these chambers today, can view the challenges we face as opportunities, not as reasons for despair." And I think about how relevant that is to what we face in our democracy today. McCall went on to say, "We can do this only if we blend our independent spirits in terms of reverence for the life and the respect for nature. Each of you who might suggest different words," right? Recognizing that sometimes different ideologies or different political parties want to talk about getting to things from a different perspective. But McCall said, "Our goal certainly is the same, a better Oregon." And I really think that we can all agree that he left Oregon a better place through his legacy. And it really is with this in mind that I think about what we face as a state and as a nation, and ultimately how we reach that goal of a better Oregon. And I think something that we know that we have to do too is applying an equity lens to that, being a better Oregon for all people, particularly those who've maybe been left behind in previous efforts of making Oregon a better Oregon. And when historic and systemic barriers have been in place that have not allowed a better Oregon in the past to be a better Oregon for all folks. And so that is something that I have made sure that we have at the forefront of our agency. And Oregon, my hometown, my place that I will live, I was born and I will someday die. Oregon is just a place of incredible beauty and wonder. And we're also a place of significant divides that can at times feel insurmountable. And I think that's definitely appropriate to call in the spirit of Tom McCall at this time, because of course he faced divides then, controversies such as the Vietnam War, and other major issues of his time. And he had a spirit of independence that transcended politics. And That's a divide that I've lived in a lot of my life. As Provost Fazer mentioned, I grew up in rural Oregon in Wasco County, and my dad was actually a single parent raising 3 kids by himself. And for the purpose of this lecture today, I'd like to start with giving you a little bit of my personal background because it informs my mission and vision as your Secretary of State. And then I want to kind of go through the different work that our office does. I'll end with elections, of course, because there's just a lot to talk about there. And but as we go, whether it's from my personal story or through the different divisions that I discussed, please feel free to pop those questions in. And I'm happy to take them as we go instead of having to save them for the very end. And so, as I mentioned, I grew up in Wasco County in rural Oregon, and my mom battled meth and opioid addiction for most of my life and was homeless in Portland, on and off the streets. And so my dad was really our stability. And I have 2 older brothers, and I was raised by a single dad. And so in all of the moments of my public service, when you see me characterized as being rough around the edges or being rough around the edges, I grew up in a house full of boys in rural Oregon, so cut me some slack. That was definitely not a pristine napkin on the lap, always knowing which fork to use type of upbringing, but very close to my older brothers, and my dad was my rock, and had a wonderful childhood despite our challenges. And we moved to the Dalles right before I started kindergarten, and then the summer before I started 2nd grade, my dad took us on this cool, like, couple-week camping trip. I vaguely remember sleeping in a big family tent and roasting marshmallows and catching fish. And we were on 8 Mile Creek in Dufur. And it wasn't until many years later that I learned that we'd actually been homeless, that we had been evicted from our home in the Dalles, and my dad didn't have anywhere to take us. And so he disguised our homelessness as a fun camping trip until he could find us a place to live. And we eventually found a trailer in downtown Dufur. And if you've been to Dufur or north of Dufur, you know why it's funny to call anything downtown Dufur, because it's a town of about 500 people with literally like 1 store, 1 street. Sometimes it's a gas station, sometimes it's shut down, and sometimes there's a gas station again. But it's a wonderful little community. It's actually where I chose to be sworn in back in January as Oregon Secretary of State on the steps of my school in Dufur because of a life-changing experience that I had in that little community. And so I started Dufur as a 2nd grader. Obviously my family was struggling. And a few years later in 4th grade was when I really learned about my mom's battle with drug addiction. And that was tough as a 4th grader when I was in the DARE program and then learning that my mom had these battles. And at least through the DARE program, when I was in 4th grade, addiction was talked about in not very empathetic terms as a public health issue, but really as a kind of things bad people do. And that was very difficult for me as a 10, 11-year-old to know that my mom was among those folks, and it was really challenging. And it led me to acting out a lot. I was a challenging student, and I, thankful every day for the Oregon teachers that probably could have taken a much firmer hand with me, but really chose to invest in me. And my 4th grade teacher in particular, he saw my acting out and he invited me to join an after-school chess club. And before you go on thinking that I was an absolute badass as a 10-year-old, this was before Queen's Gambit. So this was like back with like solid nerd chess. And I loved it and I played it and I just took to the game very, very quickly. I only have recently become cool with my association with chess, 30 years late, but I will take it. But I love chess. It just really clicked with me about the way that I think and what a strategic thinker that I think I've always been. And by the end of that year, I traveled from tiny little Dufur to Portland. I won 1st place at the Oregon State chess tournament. And my older brothers, who were usually bullying me and picking on me, when we were walking out of the parking lot at the old OMSI building out by the zoo, which is now I think the Forestry Center, but OMSI used to be out there, they were hoisting my trophy over their heads and they were chanting, "My sister's the champion." And that was, for me, one of the first times that it hit me that it didn't matter that I didn't have everything that other kids had, that I could compete with anyone. And I think to the teachers throughout Oregon schools, throughout high school and middle school and college, that really led me to have the opportunity to go to college and earn a scholarship. And I will say, that I did not attend Oregon State or the University of Oregon, but my late dad, may he rest in peace, my late dad, who I was very close to, I always say he raised me to be two things: a Republican and an Oregon State Beavers fan. And I cannot let dear old dad be 0 for 2. So I always have the Beavs in the Civil War, or not, we don't call that in the rivalry game. I always have the Beavs because I can't let dear old dad go 0 for 2 with his core values of raising me as a Republican and as a Beavers fan. He actually knew Jerry Pettibone through a Christian businessman's fellowship. And so despite the fact that we were dirt poor, we frequently attended the rivalry game off free tickets from Jerry Pettibone, the former football coach at Oregon State. So been a Beavs fan my whole life. And so, but you know, those opportunities that I think about, and before I move on to how that ties into the agency, I want to mention one more story that really stood out to me that has informed my public service. And that's when I was about 15. My brother was driving us from Eastern Oregon from the Dalles to Portland to see our mom. And at that point, we hadn't seen her in probably three or so years. This is, of course, before social media and cell phones. And if somebody didn't have a home and a landline, keeping in touch with family was extraordinarily difficult. And my mom experienced homelessness for most of my childhood. So it was very on and off. But she had written us a letter and she said she had a home and she invited us to come visit. And so my brother drove us from the Dalles to Portland and pulled up to this huge house, like a Victorian style house with a big wraparound porch. And we were like, whoa, Mom. And she greeted us. It was always very warm. She was a beautiful, wonderful, hilarious, smart human being, and hugged her. And then she walked us around to the front steps. But instead of walking up the steps, she dropped to all fours and then she crawled under the porch. And then she invited us into her home. So my brother and I dropped to all fours and crawled into the porch behind her and spent a couple hours with her sitting on a sleeping bag that she had unzipped. So we weren't just sitting on packed dirt. And she showed us a little box that she kept with her that was full of pictures of us and letters from us. And she kept that with her no matter where she was. When she was sleeping on the street, in a shelter, couch surfing, or living under somebody's porch, she always had this box to remind her that she was somebody, and that an ordinary life was still within reach, and she fought for that. And when she passed away in October of 2014, she had been clean for almost 6 years, which is the longest in my lifetime she'd ever gone. And she was living in the first house she ever owned, a little kind of 900 square foot bungalow in Umatilla, Oregon. And the minister who performed her service out at a cemetery in Echo, which is where she's buried, the minister, I think, captured her journey perfectly, and really the journey of so many Oregonians that I've noticed in my service. But the minister said, Trish, that was my mom's name. She said, Trish reached the place of an ordinary life, just an ordinary life, a job and a house and a dog. But it didn't just happen to her. She fought for it with everything she had in her. And that thought, the fact that people are out there not shooting for the stars, fighting just for the stability of an ordinary life, I would say inform my work as a civil rights attorney, as a senator, as a member of the Oregon House, and it will continue to as Oregon Secretary of State, because my mission and what I bring to this office as my vision and values is that our vision and our mission at this agency is simple. It's to build trust. It's to build trust so that Oregonians trust the public servants and the public services who can make a difference in their everyday lives. And that matters so much to me because I've lived and known the impact when public services fail, when there's a housing crisis that, separates families and leaves people behind, like my mom and like my dad experienced with us. I know the impact of a public health addiction crisis that leaves people behind. But I also know the impact and the power when public services work, like the public schools in Oregon that literally changed the outcome in the course of my life. And so that's why I see our mission at this agency is to build that trust, and so that Oregonians can trust the public services and the public servants doing those public services and actually access those to make a difference in their everyday lives. And in terms of the way we actually do that, I'll go into that now. But my predecessor, the late Secretary Dennis Richardson, once said that leading this agency as Secretary of State is like being the CEO of 4 completely different companies who really have nothing to do with each other. And that's not too far off of what it feels like. Of course, we've come up with a mission and vision and values that does, we think, combine those. But of course, we do those in really different ways. And so for our discussion today, I just want to kind of briefly walk you through the 4 different public services that I oversee as Secretary of State. We'll close, of course, with elections, as I mentioned, because I suspect that area will generate the most discussion. I'll start with the other 3, but as I mentioned before, there's someone monitoring the Q&A. And Grady or Katie, if at any point somebody has a question, feel free to jump in. I'm going to start with the Audits or the Archives Division. And if you have a question about the archives, please feel free to go ahead and mention that. And so the Archives Division in the Secretary of State's office, essentially I oversee the state archivist, and the state archives, essentially we have the papers that make up Oregon's history. And then the Oregon Historical Society has the things, the artifacts. So we have the papers and they have the things. And of course we work together. And one thing that we've been working on in the Archives Division is working with Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes to make sure that when we go through the process of saying what papers can be destroyed, that we have actually checked with Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes first, because something that maybe doesn't mean anything to someone that came from the place of privilege as a pioneer family across Oregon may mean a whole lot to tribes who represent indigenous people who lived here for thousands of years before those wagon trains arrived. And so that is something that we've had a focus. And the way that we build trust through our Archives Division is by telling Oregon's whole story. And spoiler alert, it's not all a happy wagon train story. It's a story of pain and exclusion and racism. And in many ways, telling that full story builds trust, especially when we acknowledge the places when our state institutions and our state government and our local governments have broken trust with communities in Oregon. And how we restore that is by being honest and truthful about our whole story. The poet Amanda Gorman, who spoke at President Biden's inauguration, there's a line in her poem that I've stolen a little bit of. I replaced the word American with Oregonian, but otherwise what she said is, she said, and here's where I paraphrase, she said, being an Oregonian is not just a pride that we inherit, it's a history we step into and how we repair it. And that to me is the mission and how we build trust in our Archives Division, is telling the whole story, is recognizing the ways in which our state constitution from the very beginning excluded Black people from living in Oregon, the only state in the nation that had that enshrined in our constitution, and many other ways in which our state did not honor everybody's story and everybody's experiences in our founding, and how we repair that today by acknowledging that story. And so with respect to our Archives Division, that's the work that we want to do there, is building trust through telling Oregon's whole story. I'll pause there really quickly just to see, Grady or Katie, are there any questions in particular about the Archives Division?
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Fagan. I actually do have a question. Professor Stout in our political science department had one of our students actually defended an honors thesis today that was looking on the link between having a working class background, something that obviously you can relate to, and representation of the working class in Congress. But I mean, also throughout our political offices, we know how little working class folks are represented. So the question is whether the working class elected officials are able to especially relate to the problems of that group, and whether you think that your own experiences help you have a unique perspective on the challenges that working class Oregonians face.
Certainly, and first off, I want to say that empathy is for everyone. So someone doesn't have to have a working class background in order to have empathy for folks who do. I also have known folks who came from a very similar background to mine and came to a really different conclusion, believing that they had kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps without any help, which was, again, their version of the story, and therefore others should be able to as well. So I think it informs it. I think it is it is neither necessary nor sufficient, but I think it can certainly be helpful for folks to understand, what it's like to try to, when you talk about things like the minimum wage, for example, and people think, oh, I mean, even $15 an hour, which is a minimum wage that many folks have been fighting for. And I supported that fight when I was in the legislature. It's like, man, that's still a really, really tough living. That, you know, particularly if you're trying to raise a family, particularly if you're trying to live anywhere near some of the major amenities of living in Oregon, in the metro area. And so I think the realities of understanding how it's different, I think it's important in the legislature that there is a very wide diversity of age range. There's folks who are, I believe that Rep. Winsvey Campos is the youngest woman ever elected, or maybe it was some of the members of the new class. And then there used to be, you know, Earl Blumenauer and others were there when they were in their 20s. And there are folks who are in their 70s there. And I think that that's important because I don't understand quite the same way that it is to be a senior citizen today, as many folks do. And that lived experience matters. I also think it's important for some of those folks who went to college back when you could just, you know, work a side minimum wage job and help pay your own tuition to understand that's just not the reality for students today. And so I think that it is important, but more important than having the experience, I think, is being willing to listen to other people's experience. And like I said, empathy is for everyone, and being able to listen and be like, wow, that's not my experience, but I understand and believe you that it's yours. And how do we make a better Oregon, as Tom McCall said, that includes everybody? And not just folks that have my lived experiences. Of course, even though I grew up working class, I also grew up working class and white. And so that obviously informs my experiences in a level of privilege. I grew up as a straight woman, as a cisgender person. And so there's many ways in which that has informed my experience and from a place of privilege. And so I have to recognize that other folks may have not had my same experience, even with my same life, if they'd had to face other systemic inequities. So yes, I think it matters. I think empathy matters more.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions. Grady, can I turn this over to you to pose those? Grady Goodall, who is works with the OSU Foundation, is helping me corral questions. Thanks, Grady.
Thanks, Katie. Yes, we have a couple questions and a comment. So thank you, audience members. Please keep the questions coming and we'll get to all of them that we can. I'm going to start with a nice comment from an audience member just saying thank you for hosting Secretary Fagan, and thank you for being here, Secretary Fagan. The attendee is glad to see meaningful lectures such as this. Bravo. So that's a nice comment to start with. We have two questions about the archives. First, does the state library have a role in archival work?
So we have, we essentially have the state library building in Salem is our archives building, which incidentally enough, if you talk to former Governor Barbara Roberts, who did a lot of amazing things in her service in the legislature as Secretary of State and as governor, one of the things she is the most proud of is that when she was Secretary of State, our state archives were in like a carpet factory building, and she was terrified that they would get burned down. And so she fought for the state archives building that we have today, which houses, of course, you know, I remember going in there and doing research as a law student. So it really does, you know, again, we have the papers and the Historical Society has the things. And so, yes, we have that state library system, at least if they're meeting the state, like, documents. We don't obviously control like the Multnomah County or Marion County or Benton County library system, but yes, the state library and archives.
Great, thank you. A related question to what you just mentioned. Are archive papers available for researchers and others, or are those available through the Historical Society? And maybe if you go just a step further, is there a good way to access the documents that are in the archives for our researchers, the public, anyone who wants to get access to those important documents?
Yes, it's very exciting. We actually, even during the pandemic, have continued to stay open. You know, you can call in advance and find out, because obviously we have certain limitations. But in fact, there's a great story of a woman whose naturalization papers burned down in the wildfires, that's not the great part of the story, to be clear, in the wildfires this fall, last fall in Oregon. And she was able to go, and she just had been trying to find them and calling the federal government, all this stuff. And she just walked into our state archives building and walked out with her papers, with her naturalization papers. So they have some extraordinary work that they do for just everyday people, whether it's, you know, research for a project, or your students researching for school, or, you know, somebody literally needing to access for them life documents that allow them to go on and continue to access services in Oregon. It's a really wide range of work that they do in the archives. And we also publish the Blue Book every biennium, and it is out. If you don't have it yet, it's got a beautiful photo of Haystack Rock from Cannon Beach on the cover. But yes, the Blue Book is also published by the Secretary of State's office.
Great, thank you very much. Katie, those are the questions we have about the archives. So we can go on to the next section or question from the panels. And then audience members, please do submit questions. I see a couple coming in that we'll get to in a couple minutes.
Awesome. Well, the next one, as I mentioned, we have four direct services to Oregonian. One is the archives. The second is the Audits Division. And this is the one that I think has a word that people think of audits. They're like, oh, they think of their taxes getting audited. And I will tell you that the Audits Division is the one that I probably knew the least about when I was running for Secretary of State, that I have since become the most excited about. Because while yes, we do financial auditing, and that is very important, of course, to make sure that scarce state resources are actually used effectively and efficiently, it's really performance auditing that is an extraordinary tool. And we build trust in this division by making sure that Oregon's scarce resources are making a real difference in the lives of people who need them most, that they're not leaving people out. And there's some incredible stories. You've probably, if you've lived in Oregon for the past couple of years, even, you probably saw the Department of Human Services childcare audit that came out under my predecessor, the late Secretary Dennis Richardson, that led to real and substantial changes in Oregon's foster care system and literally makes a difference in the lives of actual children and the most vulnerable children. And those are some of the big ones that get attention. But one that really stood out to me is Oregon has a prescription drug monitoring program, which of course, at the 35,000 foot level, essentially monitors the physicians who are able to prescribe opioids as a way to kind of monitor the Oregon's prescription drug and opioid crisis, which is near and dear to my heart, as that was one of the drugs that my mom really battled. And so the Audits Division did a performance audit, said, okay, how is the prescription drug monitoring program working? And is it leaving anybody behind? And through that audit, they found that veterinarians had not been covered under that program. And the auditors discovered that there were some folks who were really battling addiction who had gone so far as to hurt their own pets on purpose so that they could then be prescribed opioids from their veterinarian and that was a way to manage their addiction. And as a pet owner, my dog's literally next to me sleeping on a pile of clean clothes because I haven't done laundry folded in like weeks, and my dog's just like laying out right now on the clean clothes, which they are probably not clean anymore. But like, I'm a pet owner, and I'm also somebody who has had a family member who's suffered from that addiction crisis and that health crisis. But that's the kind of stuff that our Audits Division does. They looked at this program and they said, hey, recommendation to the legislature, add in veterinarians, because we also need to know, we need to keep Oregon's, folks who are battling addiction safe. We need to keep Oregon's pets safe from folks finding a loophole to get around that. And that's just such a real tangible way in which a performance audit can actually make recommendations to the legislature that makes a real difference in something that really hits in the heart. And we put out the audit plan every year. We put it out in February, and we just put out a very ambitious audits plan, my first one, that's going to look at a few really, we can do about a dozen a year in our discretionary look. And we're going to be looking at one of the things that we're looking at is our cannabis industry. And we're going to be looking at the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, the OLCC, and how they treat cannabis businesses as compared to distilleries and breweries and other businesses, because there at least have been complaints from folks who are in the cannabis industry that they feel like they're treated kind of as criminals, even from OLCC, that the penalties are higher and more strict and more severe than kind of the way that breweries and distilleries are treated as kind of small businesses. And so I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what an audit helps find out. They help take anecdotal complaints and determine, is that anecdote a one-off, or is it actually a systemic issue, and can we make recommendations to change it? And another question that we've asked the auditors to ask is, how about racial equity within the cannabis industry? How can cannabis licensing, or can it, have other states done this, be used as a tool of racial reparation for, of course, many, particularly Black and brown men that have spent sometimes generations incarcerated previously due to cannabis related charges? And then how do we, actually have a system where cannabis licensing is an exclusive license, and not everybody can obviously go out, you have to get those. How can that be used as a tool to kind of repair the harms of the past? Another one that we're doing is on the mortgage interest deduction, which is Oregon's largest housing subsidy. And the question is, how is it working? Is it actually encouraging home ownership? And if so, among who? And is it a way, is there also a way that the mortgage interest deduction can overcome past redlining? And, World War II allowed a lot of folks who were white veterans to get home loans, but not veterans of color, right? And there's ways that we can say, how do we actually use the services that we have, again, to the Tom McCall thing, to make a better Oregon for everyone and to not ignore the systemic inequities. And we have a bunch of cool ones. And the last one I'll mention here is we're doing an audit on Oregon's preparedness and risk of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. So we're going to be looking out throughout, law enforcement, sheriff's offices, how prepared are they? How concerned are we with folks being, infiltrated into some of those departments? They're going to be looking at that question of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. How much at risk is Oregon? What can we do to be prepared? What recommendations can we make to both the legislature, to law enforcement, to be prepared and to reduce those risks? We just get to do that through audits. Like, this is why I've become a giant audit nerd. It's not just, numbers on a page. It's really measuring performance of the very kinds of services that I believe can make a real difference in the lives of Oregonians if they're applied with an equity lens and in an efficient way that allows us to make a difference in the lives of most people with the limited dollars that we have. And so those are some of the audits that are upcoming that I'm excited about. Before I move on to the corporation division, do we have any audit questions? Have I created any other audit nerds is what I want to know.
I will out myself as an audit nerd. This is a question for me. I grew up in Eastern Oregon and Western Idaho. And in that area, I would say there's a strong culture of government stay out of my business. And then audit feels like government very much coming into my business. Is that a challenge for you as you try to push forward some of these things, and how do you deal with that?
So the authority that I have as the state auditor, as a Secretary of State to audit, comes from the Oregon Constitution. Provost Fazer mentioned that earlier as to the auditor of public accounts. That's straight from he was quoting the Oregon Constitution. Very impressive, Mr. Provost, quoting the Oregon Constitution, auditor of public accounts, or from statute that was actually put in place when Barbara Roberts was Secretary of State, which is to audit state-funded institutions. So basically, if something gets money, even if it's a private entity, if there is state money flowing there, then the auditor has a right to go in and make sure that that state money is, making doing the most good for the most people effectively. But a private industry, for example, just because there's a law regulating farming, for example, you mentioned, Eastern Oregon, Western Idaho, probably like Baker County area or something. I went to college in Nampa, so I drove the Dalles to Nampa a lot.
Malheur County.
Malheur County, there you go, a little bit farther south than Baker. So they can't just go, and the auditor, I couldn't just go and look at people's farms because it has to be a state-aided institution, or it has to be a public account, which the most obvious is like state agencies that are, literally under the purview of state government. And so I think that, in terms of the stay out of my business, the question is, well, are there any state services? Because, folks out in Malheur County are paying taxes in Oregon. They deserve the services, the public schools, the law enforcement, the fire services, right? Rural water supply and the stuff that really matters. And access to public colleges and universities and community colleges. And so the question is, okay, of the state services that are benefiting your community, could we do that better? Oh, what did we do right? What are we doing wrong? How can we do that better? And how can we do that, again, with an equitable lens to make sure that when we think of rural Oregon, we're also looking, of course, at, many of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes are out in rural areas as well. And so it's really a matter of, okay, well, stay out of your business. You are a taxpayer, and we want to make sure that your tax dollars are working for you too in Malheur County or Wallowa County, as well as they are for anywhere else in the state. And ones, for example, the mortgage interest deduction, while that audit is ongoing, it's public information that it's the largest housing subsidy. It is the 8th largest tax expenditure in the state. And it goes primarily to urban counties where, larger houses, bigger mortgages. And so asking those questions, also equity means geographically equitable, right? And are folks being served as well out in Malheur County as they are in other parts of the state? And if not, how can we make recommendations that allow them to be served just as well?
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Grady, did you have a question that you wanted to pose?
We do have an audience question. I have to jump in real quick and say I too am from Eastern Oregon and grew up in Imbler in Union County. So we have good, strong representation from the other side of the mountains tonight. We have a great audience question here. What are past or current audits you found interesting to complete? Were there any with unexpected results?
So it's cool because while I put out my audit plan this February, I get to now publish the audits that were put out under my predecessor, Secretary Bev Clarno, also from rural Oregon. I think she's out in Crook County. And so and just to be clear, like I, as the state elected auditor, I get to help decide what we audit. Also, the legislature has a joint legislative audits committee of House and Senate members that can recommend audits. Of course, the legislature can require us to audit certain things, both in statute. Oregonians can require us to audit stuff, as they did when they passed a Measure 110, which was the decriminalizing certain drugs this last measure. There's also an audit requirement. So, but for the most part, we get a lot of discretion. So I get to help decide what we audit, and I get to help decide the scope of the audit, which I mostly have just wanted to use an equity advisory table. So we're making sure that we're reaching out to stakeholders. But then once we decide what we're auditing, like my job is done, except for then helping publish it at the very end. I don't get to decide what the data is. I don't get to decide what the evidence is. And I definitely don't get to decide what the answers are to the audit. Really what I get to help do is make sure that our values, the values that I got elected on, are represented, which for me, again, is building trust. And a part of that is making sure that equity is at the core of whatever we do, no matter the audit, whether it's a financial audit, a tech audit, any kind of audit, there's always an equity lens that needs to be applied there. And so in terms of the audits, I mean, I mentioned the Oregon Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. There was another audit that was done of the Supplemental Nutrition Program, the SNAP program, that actually allowed the state auditors ended up finding a drug cartel in Southern Oregon and Klamath Falls that was essentially like a small mini mart that was operating as essentially a drug cartel, because they noticed that SNAP benefits and folks were using SNAP benefits. Again, I don't want to disparage anybody. These are like very minute. I mean, the vast majority, the good news of that audit was the vast majority of folks who are on public assistance are exactly who we want to be serving and are doing that with honesty and integrity. And I want to be very clear about that. This was a very narrow, percentage, but they found that this one like mini mart in Klamath Falls, like they had more SNAP uses than like Costco's. And they're like, wait a second, this seems really high. And it was because folks were essentially functioning this little mini mart in Klamath Falls as a drug cartel. And so they were able to turn that over and alert the authorities, which of course was a very narrow thing. The audit found actually that, upwards of 97 or higher % of recipients are the folks who are using the program exactly like intended, which is a really extraordinary testament to the honesty and integrity of Oregonians. So that's one that I just found interesting. And then the ones I've mentioned that are coming up that we're very excited about doing. One audit that we're doing in the wake of, as we just this week mourned the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, is we are doing an audit of 911 calls. But different than previous 911 audits is we want to know, okay, what kind of calls are coming in? Who are people calling 911 on? What are they saying to folks? And what kind of responses are being set out? So if I'm just, again, cannot predict any of the outcome of this audit, hasn't even started yet. So I'm purely using this as an example, but saying, if people are calling in for like, oh, there's somebody sleeping in their car or sleeping, and needing assistance, is an armed officer being sent out in response to that? Or is maybe a social worker or somebody that has access to a shelter, right? Is there ways that we can look at like the Cahoots program in Eugene and we actually named that in our audit? Are there better ways to look at public safety as not just the folks that are walking around with guns strapped to them, but how do we keep the public safe as public safety? And maybe that sometimes means that the response to a 911 call isn't somebody with a gun strapped to their hip, but it's somebody with, bread and a blanket and access to a shelter or mental health services. And so we want to look at how is Oregon responding to 911 calls? And again, can we look at models like Cahoots in Eugene and do that better and actually increase public safety, again, for everybody, a better Oregon for everybody, as Tom McCall said. So those are some that I'm excited about. There's many, many more. But essentially, we are trying to make sure that we build trust through that Audits Division by not only recognizing what we can do better, but also recognizing what we're doing right, because I think it helps encourage and give credibility to say, wow, you know, over 97% of folks who are, you know, eligible for SNAP benefits are using that program appropriately and are actually getting the services that we as Oregonians intend them to receive and supporting their families and feeding their families. It's not just, okay, what can we do better, but it's also what are we doing right and how do we do more of the right stuff is where the recommendations come in. So that's the Audits Division. The Corporation Division is, you know, we build trust here too. We build trust here by one obvious thing that we do is from Nike and Intel, the largest corporations in Oregon, down to a single sole proprietor nonprofit. Everybody has to transparently list their information and be registered to do business in the state of Oregon. You can't just set up a truck somewhere, a food truck. You can't just be doing someone taxes out of your garage and not have registered as a business so that people understand what exactly is the, you know, entity with whom I'm doing business. Where can I contact you if something goes wrong? So that transparency, of course, is key. But a big thing that we do is through the Office of Small Business Assistance, that I'm proud to say was the very first bill that I ever chief co-sponsored as a brand new baby legislator, 2013. I chief co-sponsored the bill that created the Office of Small Business Assistance in the Secretary of State's office. And if I could go back and tell, you know, 8 years ago, Shemia, like, hold tight, in 8 years, you're gonna be the Secretary of State and running that office, it would have blown my mind. I probably would have also told myself to buy stock in Zoom and Peloton, you know, and Moderna, but that's beside the fight. But yeah, I helped create that Office of Small Business Assistance, and that has grown. First, it was just kind of an ombudsman, and now it's a whole office that literally is services to Oregonians that are running small businesses. We do a lot of work every year. We want to do more, but essentially making sure that we apply an equity lens there. In fact, one of the positions that I hired for when I got elected was a new director of the Corporation Division, and we hired a woman named Eloisa Miller out of the governor's office, and her work and her background with the governor's office is in economic and business equity. And we did that because we want her to bring her expertise to that entire division, not just as a piece of a division, but to have equity all throughout to make sure that when we talk about supporting small businesses, that we're not blind to certain barriers that may exist for businesses if folks maybe don't speak English proficiently, but they maybe have amazing food they can cook or services they can provide. How do we make sure that all of our small businesses are getting that same service through our small business advocate? Again, a better Oregon for everyone. We build trust through that as well. There aren't usually a lot of questions about the Corporation Division because it's pretty straightforward, although oddly, I would say it's probably the place where the public interacts most directly with the Secretary of State's office when they're jumping on to re-register their business. But I'm happy to move on. But Katie and Grady, I wanted to see if there are any questions about the Corporation Division.
I think we're super excited to move on to elections. So we'll keep going.
Very cool. Well, last and certainly not least, I would definitely consider it my most important role is that I'm Oregon's Chief Elections Officer. And as the Provost mentioned in his opening remarks, you know, Oregon is proud of our tradition of removing barriers to voting. In fact, both Oregon's vote by mail and your Secretary of State turned 40 this year, because while vote by mail was actually used in the late 1990s, the first enabling legislation happened in 1981, which is the year I was born. So I'm very happy to be turning 40 this year, along with our vote by mail system. Of course, transparent and fair administration of campaign finance laws and supporting our county clerks. It's actually our 36 independently elected nonpartisan county clerks who actually do the mailing of ballots, the collecting of ballots, and the accurate reporting of ballots. Those are our county clerks. And if you know one, or I mean, you have a great clerk there in Benton County, but boy, reach out to them and tell them they're doing a hell of a job because they have come under fire in this past year. Like just elected administrators across the country are very demoralized. So if you've got, if you've got an extra $20, send some flowers to your local county clerk and tell them you're thinking about them because boy, they've been doing great work and really don't get a lot of the credit. They only get credit when it goes wrong. It didn't go wrong, but because people were saying it went wrong, they really did not have a fun year, despite the fact that they did extraordinary work. And in Oregon, the Secretary of State's office last year contracted with Reed College, the Early Voting Information Center, and that was to do a survey of Oregon's attitudes around voting. This was under my predecessor, Secretary Clarno, and she found some alarming results that we got reported to us this year, which is that a growing number of Oregonians are not confident their ballot was accurately counted. It was 25%, and that is 1 in 4 Oregonians said that they were not confident their ballot was accurately counted this election cycle. And the survey results showed that those views are often correlated with someone's political affiliation. But that doesn't matter. I'm Oregon Secretary of State for everybody, and it's also my job to build trust with folks across the political spectrum and to help combat disinformation and misinformation, which really is the culprit. There have been law enforcement, cybersecurity experts, election experts, and they have all come to one conclusion, which is the culprit this year really has been widespread misinformation and disinformation. And as the provost mentioned, actually, I think Katie, you're the one that I think mentioned it. It has been, we are seeing just election bills all over the country that are built on this false information about claims of voter fraud that simply aren't true and didn't exist, and yet they're being used to then pass voter suppression laws. There's this hashtag that a lot of the folks use that say easier to vote, harder to cheat. But those are somewhat in contrast. But if you're actually not having any problem with cheating, but you're trying to fix cheating, you're just going to make it harder for people to vote. And of course, there's the law that everyone heard of in Georgia, the big bill that passed about not even being able to give somebody water when they're waiting in line to vote. And there was somebody who was saying, oh, this is similar to what Oregon has. And there was a PolitiFact on Snopes that was like, does Oregon have that law? And we're like, no, people can drink wine or Pendleton whiskey while they're voting at their kitchen table because we don't stand in lines to vote. So no, there's no law about that because it would be weird if somebody gave me a glass of water when I was voting from my kitchen table, because we've done it this way in Oregon for so long. I've actually never voted any other way. And when I think about people going into a little booth and like pulling a curtain, it literally sounds like a Schoolhouse Rock cartoon to me. Like, I'm like, is that a real thing? Do people is there really a little curtain? Because I have, ever since my very first election, I graduated high school proudly from the Dalles in 1999. We've had vote by mail since 1998. Senator Ron Wyden was first elected in a special election with the first instance of statewide vote by mail. We, of course, had piloted in different counties before then. So I've never voted any other way. And I can't imagine like pulling a little curtain and hearing someone tap their shoe outside the curtain while I'm voting. But of course, in other states, they do it their way. So we've been trying to continue to talk about the security of vote by mail. We don't count our ballots on any kind of internet connected machine. So hacking really is not a concern. We have a paper trail for every single ballot. We have forensic signature verification to make sure that people's signatures match. And then we have a unique barcode tracking system. So if you turn in a ballot and then, for some reason another ballot was to get turned in, like there's a unique barcode tracking. They would never count 2 ballots from the same person. So we have all these safeguards that have shown that, and this is what I'll close with and then take elections questions, is, I am a nonpartisan Secretary of State. I do lead with my values, and I will tell you that I don't quote conservative think tanks very often, but the Conservative Heritage Foundation actually did a big study of Oregon's vote by mail a few years ago. They looked over all 20 years of vote by mail. They looked at over 15 million ballots. And they found a whopping 14 instances of voter fraud, which is literally less than 1 in a million. And I always like to remind folks that if they like coffee, I saw Gabs was drinking something earlier out of their cup. I don't know if that was coffee. It's a little bit late for coffee, but they're good. They're good. Whatever you're using is coffee. Vote by mail is safer than drinking coffee because the FDA allows up to 1% of your coffee beans to have a little bit of like mold in them. And vote by mail is safer than eating chocolate because the FDA allows up to 1% of cocoa beans to have little insect bug parts. Like the instances of voter fraud and vote by mail are so much less than 1%. It doesn't even register. So enjoy your coffee, enjoy your chocolate, and continue to enjoy vote by mail here in Oregon. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Grady, do you have some from the audience you can pose?
We do. We have some great questions.
From the panelists too. I'll let you, or Provost Fazer, did you have a question you wanted to ask? No? Okay. And we have a couple from panelists. So Grady, I'll let you go.
Yeah, we have some great questions and a couple of them overlap. So I'll see if I can combine these so we can get to everybody's questions. First, we have a question from an audience member. Is it fair for the state to pay for primary elections for major political parties, but not for minor parties?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very relevant question, particularly as we talk about things like having closed primaries in Oregon, which this is a place where I differ with my own political party, the Democratic Party of Oregon. I believe in open primaries, but under the First Amendment, freedom of association protections, and political parties have the right to close their primary. They can't be forced by the state to open their primaries. But I think this is a critical question. And some states have answered no, and basically have said, look, we're not going to fund your primaries unless you have them be open and allow, and allow anybody, whether they're a Working Families Party, Libertarian Party, Pacific Green Party, non-affiliated, to vote. And that's obviously a decision that the legislature who funds those would have to make. But I think that, other states have decided that that was not an appropriate use of state funds if states had closed, if parties had closed primaries. And I think that while I believe that Oregon should have open primaries, the thing that makes it increasingly difficult is that back in the 80s, because of the Rajneesh situation in my home county of Wasco County, we used to have same-day voter registration in Oregon, and we no longer do. Because of the fear that grew out of that situation. If you haven't watched the documentary or read the Willamette Week story, The Wild Wild West, it really is compelling. And I didn't live through it. I lived there right after that. So I remember hearing the stories and about people being poisoned. But it really spooked Oregonians to have people be able to move somewhere and register on the same day. And so we moved to having our voter registration 20 or so days before the election. And the problem, particularly to primaries, is that, these campaigns don't have a lot of money. I've run in a lot of them. You don't have a lot of money, and you really don't even start communicating with voters until they have their ballots, because that's when they're going to start voting. And so a lot of folks don't even hear about a candidate who may be running in a certain political party until after that deadline to register has passed. So they can't go vote in that primary because they've missed the deadline, but they didn't even know about the candidate because they didn't throw their TV commercials up on the air until 3 weeks before the election. And so I think that's a challenge. I think that we need to have same-day voter registration again in Oregon. And I remind, and this is, a lot of the clerks are very weary of this. And I remind them that, in my view, if the deadline had been 20 days before, then the Rajneesh would have just moved folks in 20 days earlier and still done the same thing. I don't think it's the same day voter registration that made the difference. Obviously, when you're going through that big of a scheme, you're going to pay attention to the voter registration deadline. But yeah, I think it's a legitimate question, and I think it's something that the legislature is going to have to grapple with.
Thank you. We have a couple questions that are getting at the ballot verification process. And you went through that to talk about, in addition to signatures, I think it may have been a little fast. We have a couple of people who are very interested in having you repeat that process so we can really understand how ballots are verified in Oregon.
Grady, if I'm not talking fast, it is an imposter. Like, check that person's ID, because if they're not talking fast, they're not Shemia Fagan. I always talk. So yes, so we have the 4 big pillars are: number 1, we are not connected to any internet. So while there are machines that help count ballots, they are just literally plugged into an electrical outlet. There is no internet access. So there's no way to go in and access those machines. Number 2 is we have a paper trail. So every single ballot is cast on a piece of paper that can then be verified with a post-election audit to show that the count matches up to the paper. Number 3 is we have forensic signature verification. So our clerks and the folks who do that signature matching are actually trained in forensic signature verification. And then we have the opportunity to cure. So if folks get their ballot back because the signature didn't match, no one's accusing them of fraud. It's just oftentimes, for example, people are registered now through the DMV, that automatic voter registration, which I supported, I think is a great idea. But when's the last time you signed on one of those weird like plastic signature pads and you made your signature super beautiful and precise? Well, I do not. So oftentimes that's the signature that the Secretary of State's office has on file for that person because they were registered through the DMV. And then when they sign their ballot, which is a much more deliberate signature, it doesn't match. No problem. There's a 14-day cure period. All they have to do is follow those procedures and cure that ballot, and then their ballot will be counted and they'll have a new signature that's more precise. And the fourth one, Grady, is unique barcode tracking. So every ballot, and you may not notice this, when you sign your ballot on the back, there's a nice little barcode on there, and that is unique to you. So nobody else in the state of Oregon who's registered to vote has that same barcode. And so you can only turn in one ballot. So for example, in my own primary in May of 2020, my ballot just never came. And I was like, huh, this is weird. So I called the Clackamas County Elections Office and I asked for a replacement ballot, and it came on the same day as my original ballot. But the barcode was exactly the same, but I could not have turned in both of those ballots because they were the exact same unique barcode. So I, of course, turned in one and recycled the other. But no one has to worry that somebody could turn both of those in because that unique barcode tracker only allows one ballot to be received per registered voter.
Great, thank you for going through that again. That's really helpful and gets to a couple of our questions. We have a number of questions. Please keep them coming if you would like to ask something, and we'll get to as many as possible. I have another question about ranked choice voting. What are your views on ranked choice voting?
I love ranked choice voting. I think it's a fantastic modernization of voting. I mean, there are so many times, particularly in primaries, or when you look at, I know that y'all had, at least in Benton County, for those that are registered to vote there, you had that kind of that pilot of ranked choice voting in your county commission races, and yet there wasn't that much competition. So I don't think you really got to see the way in which it could have really worked. I think, for example, Multnomah County, Portland city elections would be a great way. I mean, for some of those city council races, you'll have over a dozen really qualified candidates, and yet people have to pick one. And with ranked choice voting, you get to pick your top choice, your second choice, and your third choice. I saw it a little bit in action in Nevada in 2020. They did ranked choice voting in the caucuses this year. And my Aunt Marty, who is very dear, very, very close to my Aunt Marty, I always go up to the Nevada caucuses during presidential years and volunteer and have fun. And yes, that's my idea of fun in Nevada. I'm like in bed by 10 p.m. at whatever casino I'm staying at, but I'm out volunteering for campaigns during the day. So much fun. That's not true. I am at the craps and blackjack table at the Casino Royale. That's where you'll find me. But I went there and she was voting, and she, for some reason, like, she just loved Tom Steyer. She loved her some Tom Steyer, but she just, pretty sure he was not gonna be the top choice within her caucus where she was caucusing. So she was able to vote for him, which she had a passion for Tom Steyer. And then she voted for the number 2 and number 3 choices. And it was just so nice to not have to have somebody convince her, oh, you're wasting your vote, or the strategic voting. Let the strategy be for the campaign and political consultants. Let's just let voters vote for who they care about. I like to tell people that voting is usually one of 3 things: a love letter, a chess move, or taking out the trash. And with ranked choice voting, you can kind of do all 3. You're like, all right, this is my love letter, this is my chess move, and if all else fails, this person would be better than who the opposition would be, right? And that's my taking out the trash vote. So I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting. I would love to see it piloted in more places in Oregon. In part, we actually need money for the clerks to literally have voting machines that know how to tally ranked choice voting ballots, know how to print ranked choice voting ballots. So it is something that would take funding and a commitment from the legislature, but we've been lobbying for that, and I'll continue to do so until we see it done.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about curing ballots. One is, how is a ballot cured? How does that actually work? Do you call them and say there's an issue with your ballot? So that's the first question. And the other that's related to this is whether there's any thought being given to how to deal with changes in signatures of older voters who've been registered for decades. The cure period is good, but it can be a burden to rural voters.
Yeah. So basically you'll get a letter in the mail. You'll get your ballot back and a letter in the mail if your signature did not match. And there's a whole page of instructions, so I'm not going to be able to vote them verbatim, but you essentially have 14 days from the date of the election. And you essentially need to provide your, essentially identification and your new signature to show that your signature, that you are who you said you are. Verify that, yes, I did sign that ballot. That wasn't somebody else signing it, right? So it's a fraud protection mechanism, right? 14 cases out of 15 million ballots in 20 years. So I think we're in good shape there, but it is a protection to make sure that somebody else didn't sign your ballot for you. And then essentially you get a whole page of notes in the mail of multiple ways that you can go through it to try to prove that you are the person that cast that ballot, to make sure that your ballot is counted. And there are some elections, it's rare, but there are some elections that come down to, I remember there was a state Senate race in I believe it was 2018, And I mean, it was down to like 100 votes separating the candidates. And there was a big, there's organizations that will go out and do what's called ballot chasing. So they'll go out, they'll get the list of folks whose ballots got kicked back, and they'll go to them and say, hey, you know, do you want to try to turn your ballot in? Because again, they've already voted, that ballot is sealed. There's no changing of their vote, but it's a question of, do they want to, can they verify that that's their signature to try to, it's very rare that it does change the outcome of the election, but if it does change the outcome, it's legitimate. People have voted. They were just curing those signatures. And your questioner asked about older voters or younger voters. My first my second major election in Oregon, I got my Obama ballot kicked back to me in 2008 because I had first registered to vote, you know, as an 18-year-old young signature. And then by the time, you know, 10 years later came along, I had signed my name a lot more. So it became a little bit more of a, you know, sloppy signature. And so I didn't have a signature match. So older voters and younger voters who changed their signature, it was just a simple process of going in and changing that. But they actually, I was recently visiting the Wasco County clerk, and she said, you know, we actually, their file on a particular voter may have multiple instances of their signature. So it's not just one. Their goal in the end, again, forensic signature verification, is to determine, is this the person who signed it? They're not looking for some kind of exact match. They're saying, is this the person that signed it? And if there are like 2 different signatures they have on file for someone that they know are both that person, either one of those is going to work. It's really when it's a signature that doesn't match any of the signatures they have on file, they're going to send out that notice, and you have to cure within 14 days.
I'm loving all the questions that I'm seeing coming in, Secretary Fagan, and our panelists have some great questions too. I thought it might be a good time to transition into having our panelists briefly introduce themselves. Panelists, could you give us your name and your affiliation with OSU?
Hi, I'm Christopher Stout. I am an associate professor in the School of Public Policy.
Allison?
My name's Allison Johnston. I'm an associate professor in political science in the School of Public Policy.
Carrie?
Hi, I'm Carrie Riemann. I'm a student in the graduate program of a Master of Public Policy.
Gabs?
Hi, I'm Gabs. I use they, them pronouns. I work in the College of Science, but I'm also a graduate student in the Masters for Interdisciplinary Studies program.
Great, thank you all for being here. Carrie, can I ask you to pose your question?
Sure. My question was just related to, you talked a little bit about misinformation earlier. And so I was just wondering if you saw your office as having a role in combating misinformation, and kind of related, if so, how do you build trust in the elections process for the 25% who distrust it?
We have to have a role because it has to be everybody's job, right? I think that one of the first things I can do specifically to the, I'll kind of answer the end of your question first, which is I have to recognize that sometimes I'm not the best messenger and be humble about that. In the surveys, it was over 50% of Republicans in Oregon identified that they don't believe their ballot was accurately counted. A former Democratic lawmaker and Democratic Secretary of State probably is not the most credible messenger to them. So I need to hand over the reins sometimes and be humble enough to recognize that and find out who is most credible to them. Can I team up with Republican lawmakers? Is it the nonpartisan county clerks? Who are the best messengers to help them understand the process in a deductive reasoning way? It's not just enough to say it was accurate. It's like, hey, what part of the process are you concerned about? Let's open up the doors. Come on into the county clerk's office and actually see how this works. A couple of ways that we believe our office can be involved. One is more broadly through our civic education arm, right? I know that a lot of students in elementary and middle and high school now are being taught media literacy, and that is amazing, and they should be. So should my Aunt Marty. So should everybody. Right, I am more likely to get an article accidentally from some rando source that looks like a real newspaper but isn't, from my Aunt Marty being super alarmed, than I am from my niece who's like, yeah, that looked like BS because the font was weird. I'm like, my Aunt Marty's not going to recognize the font is weird. She just thinks it's a scary article. And so we need to teach everybody how to be their own fact checkers, how to be like, what's the source of this information? Has it been peer reviewed? Is this a reputable, media source that's been around for a long time and has stood the test of time, right? What's their motivation? Who benefits from this being true, right? Ask ourselves. So that's a broader question, but with respect, and that's for all misinformation. That's about public health and vaccines and everything, right? That's for the big one. But for elections in particular, Carrie, I think there are a few ways in which our office can be helpful when questions are specific to Oregon or vote by mail. Let me give you an example. We just recently put out a video on signature cure. So you can go to our Secretary of State's Facebook page. We just put out a video that said, hey, you may get a notice in the mail. First off, you're not in trouble. Nobody's accusing you of anything. It's really common for signatures not to match. No big deal. Here's what you do, right? Just to kind of make that not so scary. There's a couple of really perennial pieces of misinformation about vote by mail. One is people saying I can prove voter fraud because my roommate doesn't live here anymore, except I got their ballot in the mail. Therefore, I can prove voter fraud. And to that, we say, okay, they got a ballot in the mail because they're registered at that address. They probably also get credit card applications, but that's not credit card fraud unless somebody was to fill out the credit card in their name and try and get a credit card. So as long as nobody fills out that ballot in their name and perjures themselves by signing that ballot, and it goes through the signature verification process, that's not voter fraud. That's just us trying to get the ballot in the hands of every eligible Oregonian. And once you'll realize that, they go, oh yeah, okay, as long as no one turns it in, that ballot's not gonna count for anything. The other one is a common, people will say I can prove voter fraud because there are more registered voters in this county or this area than there are people who live here. And that's probably true sometimes because our voter rolls include inactive voters, right? If you, Carrie, move to California, there's no like automatic update that Oregon gets that you move to take you off the voter rolls. They'll probably continue to send you a ballot. But then at a certain point when you stop, there's a whole process to go through to deem you an inactive voter, or even if you move to somewhere else in Oregon, which now isn't as much an issue because of automatic voter registration. So you'll get automatically updated through other, different ways. But if you move to another state, there isn't an automatic way. So yes, there are lots of voters on the rolls who are inactive voters. And for some of those, they don't even get a ballot anymore because they're inactive, but they can reactivate themselves, but they're deemed inactive voters. So yes, there may be times where there's more registered voters in a place because many of those are inactive voters that are not kicked off the rolls because we don't have confirmation that they've actually moved out of state, right? So there's little bits like that when you give people information, they go, oh, okay. When instead of it being like, oh my gosh, smoking gun, this is voter fraud, they're like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. So in little ways, we can put out what we consider kind of evergreen content to say, look, if these are the common pieces of misinformation about the ballot, even the thing that I, rambling rod and through really fast that Grady made me do slower, but like people should know what our really great system is for combating voter fraud. These incredible things like unique barcode tracking, auditing of elections, these things actually make you realize, oh, okay, there really isn't a big concern that a voter fraud, 14 out of 15 million ballots is essentially what the Conservative Heritage Foundation found. So we can help by just giving that nonpartisan information. We can give it to the clerks who are often then credible sources to give it out to their communities as those nonpartisan independently elected leaders.
Thank you so much. We are running short on time. We'd like to pose another question from the audience, and then we will be happy to forward any questions that we couldn't get to Secretary Fagan so she can see what else came up. Grady?
Yes, thanks everyone for such great questions. We had two questions at least here that are related to mail voting across the country. One, how can the story of Oregon's mail voting history get more attention across our nation? And two, do you think it's scalable? Can the things that work well here in Oregon work well across the country?
Yes. And we saw that even in the way that it's, they have it in California now, they have it in Utah and Washington, they have it in states bigger than Oregon. This is not a small state. In fact, Vermont just passed. I think they just became a 6th state, or they're about to become the 6th state when their governor signed, the Republican governor will be signing that in Vermont. And they'll become the 6th state to have all what they call no absentee vote by mail, which is a really long way of just saying mail-in voting. Yes, it is scalable. The problem is for some people, there's that nostalgic tradition for them of going to the elections office and voting, to which, even Oregon's system, many folks don't know this, but we actually learned it a lot during the wildfires last year, is that every county elections office is required to have at least one voting booth. And I believe it's one per, off the top of my head, I think it's one per 50,000 residents of the county. So a large county like Marion County or Washington County or Multnomah County or Benton County is going to have more. than one, but every county has to have at least one. So if folks want to go in and cast their ballot, if there's something nostalgic about that for them, they can do that. They can do that here in Oregon. And one other thing that was brought to my attention from a national look at vote by mail is also making sure that there are safe ways for folks who are survivors of or under the threat of domestic violence in voting situations, right? When I think about the privilege of me having always lived in a safe home with safe parents and safe partners, is I think it's fun to think about voting with my parents or my partner, but that's not fun and safe for everybody if they're a victim of or a survivor, or if they're a survivor or threatened under threat of domestic violence. And so there are certain situations where it's like, oh, we have to recognize that we may need to kind of put out messaging, at least even to certain communities, to encourage, like, get the friends together and vote, and maybe encouraging folks to not be voting at home with their families, giving an escape to saying that's a great way to vote too, is with your favorite friends over wine, or, during your daily walk with your friends, right? And talking about other ways other than making it purely about voting from home with your family, because for some folks that could be triggering and extremely unsafe.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time. It's been such an honor to have this evening with you, Secretary Fagan. I think Governor McCall would be thrilled with our evening tonight, with your words, with your commitment to public service, to trust, to equity. And I want to thank all our panelists for joining us. I want to thank all of the audience for tuning in. I know that Zoom fatigue is real, but I think this has been a fascinating evening, a really wonderful opportunity to learn more about Oregon's Secretary of State duties and Secretary Fagan's priorities. Please do be in touch. We will pass along any questions or further comments that you have. And we just want to thank you very much for your time, Secretary Fagan.
An absolute honor. Thanks for nerding out with me. And happy to take those questions. And my email is just shemia.fagan@oregon.gov. That one goes directly to my inbox, not just to the general one. So feel free to shoot me an email with your question, or you can go through Katie as well. It was an honor, and go Beavs.
Go Beavs. Yeah, thank you. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.